Welcome to Colchester, said to be the oldest recorded town in all of England, with a spectacular history that dates back almost 2,000 years, when it became the first major settlement in Roman Britain. There's even more to Colchester than that, with the town home to medieval ruins, a bustling high street, the colourful Dutch Quarter, and a whole lot more. However, we start at the beginning of the town's history, with these incredible Roman remains. This is the Balkerne Gate, the largest and best preserved Roman gateway in Britain, which is believed to have been built in the 2nd century AD. But even before then, this was a significant point in Roman Colchester. In AD 49, just 6 years after the Romans began their conquest of Britain, a monumental archway was built here, to celebrate the founding of Colchester, or Camulodunum, as it was then named. Originally then, the gateway that was built here was just for show, but by the latter 1st century, Colchester was devastated by an attack from native Britons rebelling against Roman rule, led by the famous queen of the Iceni tribe, Boudicca. Boudicca and her followers burnt Colchester to the ground in AD 60, and so the Romans built large stone walls around the town to protect it from further attack. These stone walls are the best preserved Roman defences you'll find in Britain, miraculously having survived nearly 2 millennia of development in Colchester. But even after the era of Boudicca's revolt, the Romans continued to strengthen these defences to protect against Saxon raiders. However, by the medieval era, the walls fell out of use, and the majority of the defences were pulled down in 1648, leaving just these remains here. Later on, we'll talk more about Camulodunum, and why it, as the capital of Roman Britain at times, was so important to the Romans. However, looming over us here is a more modern icon of Colchester, the Jumbo Water Tower. Built in 1883, this enormous structure is made up of 1.2 million bricks, soaring 116 feet or 35 metres into the air, and once able to hold over 1,000 cubic metres of water, nearly as much as an Olympic swimming pool. Claimed to be the 2nd largest water tower in Britain, Jumbo served Colchester for around 100 years, before it became obsolete in the 1980s. But while it's an icon of Colchester today, Jumbo wasn't all too popular with the neighbours when it was first built. The tower got its name from the reverend of the neighbouring church, who was annoyed that the tower overshadowed his rectory. He called it Jumbo, after the famous elephant at London Zoo at the time. Since its closure, many projects to repurpose Jumbo have been undertaken, including efforts to turn it into an apartment block, restaurant, observation tower and more. None have quite succeeded yet, but the tower remains protected as an important part of Colchester's skyline. As we now make our way away from the town's walls, it's about time that we had a look at where exactly you'd find Colchester on the map. As you can see, Colchester sits in the county of Essex on the southeastern edge of East Anglia, located roughly 50 miles from London. Interestingly, after Boudicca's revolt destroyed both Colchester, or Camulodunum, and London, or Londinium, both towns were rebuilt, but London went on to supersede Colchester as the capital of Roman Britain. Had things turned out very differently, perhaps Colchester would still be the nation's capital today. Either way, we're now looking up at St. Peter's Church, which has a history dating all the way back to the 11th century, and which sits at the top of North Hill, near to the busy heart of Colchester. Down at the bottom of the hill in the distance is the River Colne, which snakes around the northern edge of Colchester, and which is thought to have been the site of some of the earliest prehistoric settlement in the area. Of course, the town of Colchester emerged up on top of this hill, where you'll find an eclectic range of buildings and architecture from a variety of historical eras, such as this half-timbered building, once home to the town's post office. This brings us onto Colchester's High Street, which originally developed as a part of the route from London to the coastal port of Harwich, 20 miles to the east of here. Today, the High Street is far too narrow to be part of a major cross-country route, now lined with grand buildings like the old Essex and Suffolk Fire Office, first built in 1802. Originally, this elegant Georgian building was a multi-purpose facility, housing horse-drawn fire wagons on its ground floor, while the upper floor was used as the corn exchange, where corn was bought and sold. It was also notable as the first fire office to be built outside London, but is now part of the furniture on Colchester's High Street, home to just a few of the many shops on this half-mile-long drag. As we mentioned, this road has been the main street in Colchester for almost 2,000 years, linking the Balkerne Gate to the west with the town's eastern gate. In the Roman era, the High Street was much straighter than it is today, a classic feature of Roman roads, while the streets that emanated from it, inside the walled town of Camulodunum, were laid out in a grid pattern, innovative for Britain at the time. There's all manner of intriguing places on and around the High Street, but here we find a lady who seems to have suddenly stopped in her tracks. This 7'3" tall statue is simply known as the Walking Woman, placed here in the middle of the High Street in 2017. The statue is meant to portray a deliberately anonymous figure, but also a striding, driven member of Colchester's community. Just make sure not to bump into her when you're walking down the pavement here. And when the Walking Woman was unveiled, she wasn't alone. Walking down Colchester's High Street, you may have missed this statue of a man holding a cup of coffee, also meant to represent a typical, relatable working person in Colchester. Continuing on down the High Street now, this is where the road begins to curve ever so slightly from the Romans' originally dead straight path. One of the reasons for this was that, after the Romans abandoned Britain in the 5th century AD, Colchester too was almost entirely abandoned, with very few people living inside its walls for the next few centuries. The roads and buildings of Colchester had fallen into disrepair, and it wasn't until the arrival of the Normans in the 11th century that the town became a place of major settlement again, with the building of a grand castle further down the road, and a moot hall, or general meeting hall, just here. The site of the Normans' Moot Hall is today occupied by Colchester's Grand Edwardian Town Hall, which was built in 1902. The early medieval Moot Hall had stood for around 600 years beforehand, but the growth of Colchester in the 19th century meant a new, bigger town hall was eventually needed. Today, the town hall is best known as the centre point of Colchester's biggest yearly celebration, the Oyster Feast. Held in late October since 1845, the Oyster Feast is a surprisingly grand celebration of one of Colchester's local delicacies, where a grand oyster-based lunch is held in the town hall, attended by locals and dignitaries from around the country, and in some cases, from around the world. But as we look across the High Street towards Colchester's Hippodrome, which once hosted Charlie Chaplin, why exactly do oysters matter so much to this town? Well, the history of oysters in Colchester, like so much of the town, goes back to the Romans, when an oyster fishery emerged on the River Colne to the north of the town centre. By the medieval era, the oyster industry had become a major part of the local economy, with Colchester's oysters still considered by many to be among the finest in the world. The oyster industry continues to this day, albeit no longer making up quite as significant a part in Colchester's economy. That said, restaurants in town and on nearby Mersey Island will often have locally sourced oysters on the menu, if you fancy giving them a try when you visit. Now, we've made our way off the High Street onto West Stockwell Street, one of a number of back roads in Colchester, home to some of the town's more surprising stories. It's also where we'll find the colourful Dutch Quarter, which we'll talk more about in a moment or two. This is also where the once grid-patterned roads of Roman Camulodunum existed off the main road through town, but when the Anglo-Saxons and later Normans came to settle Colchester, the town centre was replanned and laid out in a slightly different way, albeit still rather ordered for a medieval English town. That was around the time that this church, St Martin's, was first built. Though no longer used for worship, this is one of the oldest buildings in Colchester, originally built in the 12th century, and despite restorations later on in its life, still features many Roman bricks in its exterior stonework. Roman bricks were used to a wide extent for construction in medieval Colchester, as people at the time were probably unaware of the significance that this place had held 1,000 years beforehand. Today, though, many people may not be aware of the significance of this house, which was once the home of sisters Jane and Anne Taylor. The Taylor sisters, who lived here from 1796 until 1811, became well known as writers of children's stories and nursery rhymes. While they were living here, the sisters in 1806 published a poem named The Star, the first line of which reads, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." Amazingly, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star isn't the only nursery rhyme thought to have its origins in Colchester. The town walls where we started our walk are also said by some to be the place where the tale of Humpty Dumpty was born. The story came from the Siege of Colchester in 1648, during the English Civil War, when the royalist defenders of Colchester had placed a large cannon on top of the wall, or possibly on top of the church just inside. It's said that the cannon, or possibly the man firing it, was known as Humpty Dumpty, and the parliamentarians, who were laying siege to Colchester, made it a priority to bring down the cannon. Eventually they succeeded, and despite the efforts of all the king's horses and all the king's men, they couldn't put Humpty together again. The Siege of Colchester was a major event in the town in the 17th century, and came just after Colchester had seen an influx of Dutch and Flemish immigrants, who gave birth to this part of town, the Dutch Quarter. From around 1550, there was a large exodus of Protestant people from the Low Countries, which had come under the control of the Catholic Spanish crown, known as the Spanish Netherlands. Fearing persecution, many Protestants fled the Netherlands to eastern England, with Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex all seeing a surge in Dutch immigration. Welcomed by the local English, the Dutch became an integral part of many towns in the region, with the Dutch Quarter emerging as a thriving centre of weaving and cloth-making in Colchester. Passing by St Martin's Church, which actually had its tower damaged in the siege of 1648, we'll continue walking through the Dutch Quarter, which is home to an array of colourful homes as we've already seen, as well as a number of Tudor-era buildings. The people who came across from the Low Countries were best known for their weaving skills, bringing innovative techniques to the already strong weaving industry in England, that further bolstered domestic production. By the turn of the 17th century, thanks to the influx of the Dutch, Colchester had developed into one of England's foremost walled towns, with the houses that line the streets of the Dutch Quarter dominated by weaving, which added to the historic oyster and fishing industries that had seen Colchester grow in the medieval period. Throughout the Middle Ages, Colchester served as the main regional commercial centre, with its market, historically held on the High Street around the Moot Hall, attracting traders from across Essex and Suffolk, bringing with them a range of goods from fish to meat, wool and more. Wool dominated the working lives of many of the medieval town's inhabitants, almost all of whom lived within the old Roman walls, despite the steady decay of the ancient defences. Handloom weavers worked in their homes through the day, and so many of the houses in the Dutch Quarter were built with larger than normal windows, to allow as much light in, which extended potential weaving hours. The town's wool mills, however, were largely located on the River Colne, powered by its flow. Today, if you walk along the river, you'll see a number of old buildings that date from a time when Colchester was a prominent wool-making town, though the local industry fell away as technology developed on a much larger scale. Here on the eastern edge of the Dutch Quarter, meanwhile, we find St. Helen's Chapel, one of the oldest buildings in Colchester, thought to have been built even before the Normans arrived into town. But the history of this nearly 1,000-year-old chapel goes back even further, as it stands on top of the foundations and ruins of a Roman theatre, which was built after the sacking of Colchester by Boudicca. Boudicca's revolt in AD 60 was a seminal moment in the early history of Colchester, not only resulting in the burning of the town, but the slaughtering of as many as 30,000 of the town's Roman inhabitants. Those numbers come from Roman estimates, but that would have made Camulodunum one of the most densely populated places in Roman Britain at the time. For context, Colchester today is home to around 130,000 people, but spreads far beyond the bounds of the old Roman walls. Having now made our way through the colourful and calm Dutch Quarter, we find ourselves in the leafy Castle Park, which is littered with Roman remains, including the site of former villas and a number of pieces of old stonework. However, as you'll have guessed from the park's name, this is most famous as the home of Colchester Castle, which is one of the oldest and largest Norman castles that survive in England today. Sitting at the head of this expansive town park, Colchester Castle is believed to date from around 1076, built in a part of the town that was already the home of a significant building. Before this castle was even built, this site was home to the Roman Temple of Claudius, built in 54 AD. One of the most important buildings in Roman Britain, the ancient temple was a symbol of Camulodunum's grandeur, and a worthy monument to the town that the Romans chose as their capital for Britannia. After the Romans abandoned Britain in the 5th century, the temple, like the rest of Colchester, began to decay. However, by the time the Normans arrived, the abandoned temple was still fairly intact, and under the orders of William the Conqueror, much of its stone was used to build the castle that followed it. Local natural stone was scarce in Colchester, and so the Normans made full use of the Roman remains in constructing this castle. Following the outline of the huge Roman temple, Colchester Castle was built with the largest tower of any medieval castle in Europe, the vast majority of which remains intact before us today. The castle keep here shares a striking similarity with the central White Tower at the Tower of London, which was built around the same time. Much like the Tower of London, Colchester Castle was a significant fortress of the medieval era, visited by a number of kings, and having undergone a dramatic siege in the year 1216. That was during the First Barons' War, when Colchester Castle was briefly taken over by French forces, who were supporting Prince Louis to become king instead of John, with whom they had gone to war after John broke the terms of the Magna Carta, signed the year before. John's forces ultimately took the castle, and it's believed that the siege was responsible for the greatest damage to this otherwise spectacularly preserved fortress. At the foot of the fortress, meanwhile, we can see the remains of a small chapel that was built in the Anglo-Saxon period beside the ruins of the old Roman temple. It was incorporated into the castle by the Normans, but was later buried under the ground, until being unearthed in excavations in the 1930s. As for the castle, after its action-packed early life, it remained in royal hands until the mid-17th century, when it was actually set to be demolished. Fortunately, it was saved, and was later used as a large prison, before gaining its current use as Colchester Museum from the late 19th century. But here, just out in front of the castle, we can see a rather impressive wooden sculpture of an elephant, an animal that you might see popping up in many different places in Colchester. The elephant has become a bit of a mascot for Colchester, and not just because of the story of Jumbo and the water tower. Colchester Zoo is home to 4 popular African elephants, but they weren't the first of their kind to visit this town. When Colchester was founded in the Roman era, it was originally designed as the home of an army garrison, a leading general of which requested reinforcements. Emperor Claudius fulfilled the request, sending over troops from Gaul, or modern-day France, who are said to have been accompanied by a small herd of elephants. That's why you'll see a number of delightful elephant-shaped signs, statues and more around Colchester. On the edge of Castle Park, meanwhile, we can see a beautiful Georgian-era townhouse, known as Hollytrees House. Built in 1719, this colourful house has been the home of many important Colchester residents, most notably one Charles Grey, the MP for the town in the 18th century. Grey was the man responsible for saving Colchester Castle from demolition, while he also planted a number of holly trees in the gardens of Hollytrees House, which is obviously where the building gets its name from. Overlooked by Hollytrees House and the castle here, we find Colchester's Grand War Memorial, which sits at the entrance to Castle Park. The focal point of remembrance services in the town, this war memorial of 1923 is topped with a sculpture of the Winged Victory, and is dedicated to the Colchester locals who have lost their lives in conflicts since 1914. By the way, this brings us back onto Colchester's High Street, although at this eastern end you can see how the road is drastically different from the straight Roman road that once ran past here. Across the road is the former All Saints Church, built in the 15th century, but which closed down in 1953. As we've seen, Colchester is home to a range of medieval churches, but this one is now the home of the town's Natural History Museum, where you can learn about a rather surprising story from 1884. That was the year that Colchester was rocked by the Great English Earthquake, the most destructive to have hit the UK in the last 400 years. As you'll know, we don't really get earthquakes in this country, or at least not many recognisable ones, but the Colchester earthquake of 1884 measured 4.6 on the Richter scale, and damaged around 1,000 buildings, many of which were in Colchester, as well as a number of villages in between here and the Suffolk town of Ipswich. It's thought that only a couple of people died in the earthquake, but it was a huge shock to the people of Colchester, and left a lasting legacy that's still remembered in the town to this day. Remarkably, many of Colchester's Roman and medieval remains survived the earthquake, but here we find an example of rather more modern local architecture, the Firstsite Art Gallery, or, as it's affectionately known by the people of Colchester, the Golden Banana. Opened in 2011, the Banana is home to a wide range of modern art, while you'll also find an 1800-year-old Roman mosaic inside, which was accidentally found in the early 20th century by a local gardener. As you can see from this aerial view, the building does indeed curve around like a banana, and is certainly an unusual landmark in historic Colchester, although it is renowned for standing on Roman-era foundations. Just beside the gallery, meanwhile, we can see the rear of the Minories, a Tudor-era house that for centuries served as a family home, before it became an art gallery in the 1950s. It was the home of Firstsite until 2008, before the gallery moved into the Big Banana next door. All of these striking art centres sit among one of the oldest parts of Colchester, known as St Botolph's Quarter. The name for the area comes from the huge early medieval St Botolph's Church and Priory, the ruins of which still stand today, and which we'll now make our way towards. This brings us onto Queen Street, far from the oldie-woldy lane that you might expect from this ancient area of the town, but which showcases how Colchester has continued to develop through the centuries. Despite all that evolution, the town still retains much of the heritage that it was founded with by the Romans. As we mentioned, Camulodunum was originally established as a military garrison in AD 43, a role which the town still performs to this day. During the Napoleonic Wars, a large military barracks was built in Colchester to house over 7,000 soldiers, which was then expanded into further wars through the 19th century. Today, Colchester Garrison, located down at the bottom end of Queen Street, is home to 16 Air Assault Brigade combat team, composed of over 6,000 rapid response troops. We won't have time to visit the barracks today, but there's still an expansive complex that form a significant presence in Colchester, connecting it with the town's illustrious military history. Of course, as we've seen on this walk, there's a lot more to Colchester than its Roman military heritage. While that was where the town was born, and was perhaps its heyday having acted as capital of Britannia, the medieval period brought with it yet more notoriety and development. We've already talked about the strengths of the town's oyster and weaving industry, but in the aftermath of the Normans' arrival and the building of the Grand Castle, a huge priory was built in the town, one of the first of the hundreds that were later founded across England. That priory was St Botolph's Priory, built in the year 1100, and which initially emerged as a key religious centre in Colchester, before becoming slightly overshadowed by the 15th century St John's Abbey, which stood just a few yards away from it. Here, just off Queen Street, we find the extensive remains of St Botolph's Priory, a spectacular example of the grandeur of architecture that defined early medieval Colchester, and which has also miraculously survived over 900 years of development in the town. Actually, the priory even survived the earthquake of 1884, perhaps because it was built in part with reused, sturdy Roman bricks that occupied the site beforehand. Early on in its life, this priory was home to a small community of monks that sponsored fundraising in the town, but it only remained in operation for about 400 years before it fell victim to King Henry VIII's dissolution of the Monasteries campaign in 1536. The priory church, which we're tiptoeing inside now, still remained in use for another century or so, although it eventually met its end in 1648, when parliamentarian cannon fire during the Siege of Colchester destroyed much of the structure. In all honesty, given everything that Colchester has been through over the last 2,000 years, from Boudicca's burning of the town to the First Barons' War, the siege in 1648 and the earthquake in 1884, it's astonishing that any old buildings are still standing, let alone the wealth of historic monuments that populate the town today. In fact, speaking of resilient landmarks, this is the modern-day St Botolph's Church, built in the Victorian era. It looks fairly untouched, but in 1943 it was actually hit directly by a bomb. As luck would have it, the bomb hit a radiator inside, which caused a flood of water that extinguished the fire caused by the explosion, saving the church from ruin. And that, if anything, shows why Colchester is such a treasured town. Claimed to be the oldest in England, this town has been through so much over the centuries, but through thick and thin, its history remains on spectacular display to this day. As we look up to the ruins of the 900-year-old St Botolph's Priory, that brings us to the end of our walk in Colchester. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and that you're looking forward to visiting this fascinating town for yourself sometime soon.